My name is Rusty Osborne, and I am Associate Professor of Biblical and Theological Studies here at College of the Ozarks, and have been here for 10 years. I have 4 kids, currently enrolled at SofO, so deeply invested in what's going on here at the school. And this is my wife, and she can introduce herself and go for it.
I'll introduce myself off mic.
Yeah.
I'm Sara Osborne. I am Rusty.
I'll just hold it. I'll hold it.
It doesn't need to be on the. Okay. I share the same 4 children. I too teach. It's important to know. I teach as an adjunct in the English department at the college. I teach mostly writing classes, but also direct the students who do a minor in classical education, which we're now offering at the college. So. And then occasionally teach a class on teaching English to speakers of other languages. That's what my background's in. In addition to teaching writing at the college, I do visit SofO quite often. We have one child who's a struggling reader that I work with regularly in coordination with his teacher, and obviously our other 3. We still consider ourselves their primary educators, even though they're here at SofO. So we are very invested in what's going on here at School of the Ozarks.
Yeah, and we are excited to reflect on the topic this morning, metaphor and interdisciplinary learning. It's something that we have kind of talked about as a couple, and one of the nice things about having a co-presenter that you live with and run with and things is you get a lot of dialogue time, right? So we've been kind of kicking ideas around together. But before we jump in, let's take a second and just go to the Lord, ask His blessing on our time and on the conference. God, we are deeply grateful for the opportunity to gather as brothers and sisters in Christ, committed to learning and excellence in the classroom and seeing the next generation grow in the knowledge of You. Lord, I thank You for the people who are here this afternoon in this room, but also across the rooms and the conference. And Lord, I pray that this afternoon and tomorrow morning that it would be a time that is enriching, that is encouraging, as we turn our attention to the task of teaching. Lord, there is nothing more humbling than the fact that we cannot make human beings do what we want them to do. But God, we believe that You can. We believe that You are a God who shapes lives and shapes minds and hearts. And we commit once again our students entrusted to us, and we pray that You would make us good stewards of the time that we have with the people You put into our care, that You would make us diligent to learn and to grow and to think afresh about ways that we can point them toward the beauty and grandeur of the gospel. And Lord, we pray that You would use this afternoon in a small way to accomplish that end. In Jesus' name, amen. So as we get going thinking about metaphor, in 2021, our family experienced the wonderful thrill of exploring one of the wildest places in North America. We got to go to Alaska. And we were super excited about this. We're mountain people. We don't like sand. We don't want the beach, so we're like glaciers, mountains. This was what we were craving for, and we crammed as much adventure as we could into the days that we were there. And one of the most exciting moments we had was we got to do one of these cruises around the rocks and cliffs of Resurrection Bay, which is a pretty famous bay up around Alaska, and they're known for families of orcas that live in Resurrection Bay. So we're out on this cruise ship trying to spot these orcas rolling around in the sea. And, kind of doing our best at National Geographicing, we held our binoculars like ready to engage in this aquatic game of hide and seek. And that's really what it felt like, because you would see one surface here, and then it would go under. Then one would surface here, would go under, and over there, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. And in one sense, it felt like there was just this random appearances. But we actually know, and were we to take more time and to study, there's a whole world underneath the surface of connections and movements based on tide and resources and habitat, to where actually scientists can kind of track the movements of these animals. They know where they're going. They know how they are swimming. But what seemed like a random series of up and down movements could be better understood if we understood kind of the context and the habitat. And so putting together these brief surface encounters, we began to understand something of the mysterious swimming patterns that were happening beneath the surface. And we knew the orcas were still around even though we couldn't see them. But we only had brief moments to try to put together a way of life beyond what we could see. And in one sense, metaphors provide us with momentary glimpses into the things that we can't simply observe. Right? They are these kind of moments of connection that come and go and tell us about a richness and complexity that we can't see otherwise. So I think oftentimes, and we'll talk about this in our session today, oftentimes we relegate metaphors to the level of simple sentences, right? And historically, metaphors have kind of been thought about as like a literary flourish, right? It's a neat turn of phrase. It's a way to say something that's got some rhetorical punch. But actually, metaphors are doing more than that. Metaphor is really observed in some significant ways, but like the orcas of Resurrection Bay, they don't merely disappear once they are encountered. They live on beneath the surface, reproducing other metaphors and impacting the world in the way that we think about it. So what we want to see is that metaphors are not just these kind of one-off lines that make a connection. It's actually a way that we kind of think about the world. Metaphors provide the categories by which we understand what we experience. And so metaphors exist as these abstract connections between realities that help us make sense about the world. They help us make sense of the world around us. And it's at this conceptual level, not the literary, but really the conceptual level, that metaphor functions so significantly as a meaning-making strategy in multiple disciplines, right? And so the idea is, how is metaphor helpful in thinking about interdisciplinary learning? Well, metaphor becomes this level of abstract connection that transcends one discipline. So just by way of example, today we want to look specifically at kind of the fields of poetry, science, and theology, and how metaphor shapes the way that we think about, the way that we communicate and reflect on these seemingly disparate topics, right? I mean, can you get any more opposed to one another than science and poetry? And on our campus in the college, I mean, the science that we're separated by a street. There's a street running right down the middle of the campus, you know, and the poetry folks rarely cross that street, and the science folks rarely cross it. I mean, there are these patterns of how we process reality. And I don't think that we often see the unifying quality of metaphor that helps us bridge those connections in a way that's beneficial to us. So that being said, I'm going to literally pass the mic to my wife, Sara, who's going to share a little bit about John Dunn's poetry and his reflection on metaphor and science.
Thank you. Give me a second to... Okay, so we had a little bit of a handout mishap. So these are not stapled, but you might get confused if you don't put them in the right order. So they are front and back. If we could just pass these around and know that the one that has the title at the top in the center is the first page, and then the second page is the continuation of the poem this way. C.S. Lewis is on the back. So if you want to just take one of, I'm going to drag the microphone away. This is all very technologically awkward here. Okay, so my task is to talk a little bit about metaphor in literature and writing, which is obviously a vast domain that I couldn't possibly cover in 10 or 15 minutes. So I thought it might be appropriate to just pick a case study. And interestingly, it was during my own teaching of college composition this semester, my students were writing on a prompt that offered them 3 quotes about the human condition. And they were to look at the similar message of each author and then analyze how each author's worldview affected his tone and how he communicated this message. And the first one was African statesman M. Césaire. The second one was German philosopher Karl Jaspers. And then the third one was John Dunn. The first one had some things to say about, colonial influence, that kind of thing, and his place in history. The second one spoke from a more philosophical standpoint. And the third one, the reason that John Dunn's tone was so different than the others was because of his use of metaphor. And since my husband and I had been kicking this topic around a lot, I noticed that right away. And I thought, I wonder if this is something that is a John Dunn thing, that maybe I should dig a little deeper. So I started into the black hole of reading John Dunn poetry. I've read, obviously, many of his poems before, but it was only when I began to view it through the detective lens of looking for metaphor and how it affects the meaning of his message and what his metaphors connect to outside of the poem, did I really see it in a new way and thought, aha, this guy is who we need to analyze for the purposes of this workshop. So that's kind of how I came to this. And as I was looking for other people's assessment of the power of his use of metaphor, I came across an excellent quote from Malcolm Guite, who is himself a poet. And I actually, just as a brief aside, I would highly recommend his book of poetry that leads you through the season of Lent up to Easter. Now would be a great time to dip into Malcolm Guite. But he says this about Dunn. Dunn's intellect and imagination delighted in double visions and multiple meanings. He was fascinated by the representation of one thing within and through another, by the correspondences between inner and outer worlds, by the shifts in perspective and dimension which could be produced by moving suddenly, by means of metaphor, between the many worlds of his intellect and imagination. And I just read that emphasized part. You can read the rest of the quote there on your handout, but I thought, absolutely, it is this kind of double vision that he has. One foot in the world of poetry and one foot in, at times, geography, at times, botany, at times, architecture, that even in Dunn himself as a writer, he is bringing the disciplines together. He is acting as a whole person, experiencing the world around him as a writer. So what I've done in this handout is just to provide you with several excerpts. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but I did have to cut myself off at one point. Do we have enough handouts for everyone? Maybe we could make a couple more. I find that this is really hard to follow along with if you just have to listen to me read excerpts of poetry. It's much easier to see in print. And what I've done in each of these excerpts, the boldface words are the words that I want to point out to you that are connecting with metaphor to something outside the world of literature and poetry specifically. So the first one will be no stranger to most of you. Most of you have heard the phrase, "No man is an island." This is actually part of this is what was being used in my composition prompt on the human condition, talking about how what happens to one man affects the whole community. But Dunn uses the metaphor of island and continent. No man is an island. Every man is a piece of a continent, and of course, later on even mentions Europe specifically. He's locating himself geographically by connection, but he's also using that metaphor to connect to other people's understanding of geography in order to apply meaning to this particular message. So here we have Dunn connecting to geography. In the next poem, The Good Morrow, he connects to architecture and geography. He does this in multiple poems where he refers to room. In this case, for love, all love of other sights controls and makes one little room and everywhere. Let sea discoverers to new worlds have gone. And he goes on to eventually down in the second stanza, we have hemispheres and north and west. So here he is talking about making one little room and everywhere. So kind of giving a boundary message here with the idea of a room, of understanding of architecture. He does this in the next excerpt as well, a valediction of my name in a window. Here we have even components of architecture. We get rafters, tiles, which form the structure for building a house. He says, the rafters of my body, bone, being still with you, the muscle, sinew, and vein, which tile this house will come again. What we know about biology, muscle, sinews, veins, forming structure that is then tiled, and then rafters being kind of the thing that the roof is built upon. Without some sort of understanding of architecture, you miss the meaning of this poem. I can't help but think, what if we're studying architecture, and I don't know, maybe would that probably fit most likely in a history class, maybe historic architecture, and you bring in a poem, maybe even from the same time period, and it helps the students then apply what they've learned about architecture, or in this case also, the body, muscle, sinew, and bone, the skeleton, how the body is structured and is formed, applying those concepts then to help understand poetry. Geography makes an appearance again in a valediction of weeping, and this one, let's see, is on actually the top of the next page, where I have Europe, Africa, Asia, globe, world, and waters. So it would appear that Dunn has a lot to say to any of you who would teach geography. Maybe it would be a really fun idea to bring in some of his poetry when you're talking about the hemispheres, directions, the continents. I found just in my brief research that geography, and he has a particular interest in mapping even. So if ever you were doing a lesson on cartography and mapping, Dunn would be an excellent resource to bring in just to cross the disciplines there between literature and what you're doing in that lesson. The next one, Love's Growth, is an example of using metaphors that have to do with science. Here he's talking about blossoms on a bough that root and bud, the idea of plant growth. So any of you that teach science, if you ever wondered, could I bring poetry into my science classroom? I'm going to give you several ways you can do that. But here's one, talking about the life cycle of plants, how they grow. In the last two lines here, he's saying that love deeds are like blossoms on a bough. From love's awakened root do bud out now. Well, what do we know about buds on flowers and how the roots affect them and the root system? How can we apply that understanding then to the concept of love? So here we are not just talking about poetry, not just talking about plant science, but also here we have a little lesson on love. What is love? So here now we're crossing over even to the realm of theology, I think, crossing multiple disciplines. The next one is an interesting one, Love's Diet. It made me think it was a good one for Southwest Missouri, maybe. Here we're hitting on science and wildlife. We have the metaphor of a buzzard, a falconer, and even game. If you flip over, you'll see the other two. The buzzard is on the front. And then, of course, what do we know about buzzards and scavenger birds, a falconer. Here he's talking, there is a moral lesson in this poem about birds of prey. Here preying on a mistress who is like a killed game, dead meat that's been ravaged. There's a lot to be said there, but you won't get it if you don't understand what birds of prey are like or anything about their behaviors and patterns of behavior. The last one that I have here, An Anatomy of the World, I think we could just sit and ponder for quite a long time. And there's actually been a lot written about this one. And if any of you are teachers in the sciences, I think this would be a really, really wonderful piece to try to put into your science classroom. This actually is not a poem that was directly or overtly written about the scientific revolution or this new philosophy, but it is absolutely chock full of messages about it. It was actually written, I believe it was on the death of a friend, and he just writes this. This is a very long poem, and this is just an excerpt from it. But in it, we get this just really interesting segment on this new philosophy that's happening. He references astronomy, philosophy, There is some debate about whether this has to do with like Reformation philosophy or whether it's the scientific revolution. I do think there's a lot here about kind of just how philosophy is breaking down what was known. And so certainly that could be applied to several different spheres, whether it's theology or the sciences. But I'll just read through this one so we can get some of the message. And new philosophy calls all in doubt. We could probably stop there and apply that to all kinds of things, right? The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost, and the earth and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world's spent, when in the planets and the firmament they seek so many new. They see that this is crumbled out again to his atomies. 'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just apply and all relation. Prince, subject, father, son are things forgot, for every man alone thinks he has got to be a phoenix, and that then he can be none of that kind of which he is but he. And then if you keep going down, you'll see some more about astronomy and magnetic force in nature, which can also be wrapped up in the sciences. I really feel like this excerpt from this poem could be a really interesting catalyst for conversation if you were doing a class on the scientific revolution. And kind of, well, what is this new philosophy? What is it about the tenets of it or what it's doing in the realm of science that he's commenting on here? And why would he choose that to apply to this situation that he's, mourning the loss of a friend? What's he mourning the loss of in this scientific revolution? How can you make those connections to inform the other, right? And I think that's what Rusty was trying to say in the beginning, is that when you see these metaphors, yes, any of us who are teaching poetry or literature are going to say, what's this referring to, Why is he choosing an island? What does that mean about man? Why is he choosing a buzzard? Why is he choosing, any of these individual words to help us unlock the meaning of the poem itself, which is good and right, but also why a poem about the scientific revolution? Why would he draw on plant growth? What is there that can be transferred in meaning, not just to the poem, but also to the other discipline that it's holding hands with? So this is just kind of a zooming in on some of his metaphors in poetry, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk just a little bit about also the use of metaphor in writing for us as writers and teachers of writing. I share this quote from C.S. Lewis with my students in college composition. It's a serious mistake to think that metaphor is an optional thing which poets and orators may put into their work as a decoration and plain speakers can do without. The truth is that if we're going to talk at all about things which are not perceived by the senses, we are forced to use language metaphorically. This is something that crosses over into all disciplines, and whether we are writing poetry, whether we are writing about any of the other disciplines, or speaking any way that we are trying to communicate using words, whether speaking, writing, even absorbing it through reading, there is a necessity for metaphor because it helps us make connections with human experience. It helps us take the concrete that we experience every day when we feel the heat of the sun, when we watch the roll of the waves, when we see the orcas swim, and it helps us apply that to abstract concepts. That's one benefit of metaphor as far as crossing the disciplines, but it's not the only one. The other one is to help us make sense of one in light of the other, and vice versa. So I've tried to show you a little bit of how this pops up, how we're seeing other disciplines connected through metaphor to poetry, specifically with John Dunn. Rusty will speak a little bit now about the sciences and theology.
Okay, so one of us has their act together, and that's why you have a handout. But I do want to just share some thoughts about metaphors and science and metaphor and theology. And one of the significant takeaways that I have encountered in thinking about metaphors for about the last decade or so is really the transition to seeing metaphors as a way of describing the world and making connections about things, not just as these kind of literary phenomena. And in fact, even in John Donne's poetry, I mean, you can see there metaphors are often not just a one-time thing. They appear in constellations. Right? So, I mean, almost each example she has, there's multiple kind of bold-faced words because the poet is inviting you into this world of seeing this thing as this thing, right? And that's the power that metaphor has. It's very creative in making new associations. Good metaphors take things you have never put together, and now you put them together. That creates a new level of understanding that if it's a really good metaphor, you'll never go back, right? Metaphors define the way that we think about things, and so much so that we build them into our speech, we build them into communication. They just become the way we see the world. Right? I had a student yesterday giving a presentation actually about metaphor, and he kept using the language like, the author's really running away with this one, and this one's, and I'm like, I mean, we can't even talk, right, without kind of embracing these kind of metaphorical patterns. And we shouldn't be surprised then, as Lewis said, that we find metaphors really, whenever humans are talking, we're doing metaphors. And that even happens when we turn our attention to the natural world around us and begin to describe things in the realm that we think of as science, right? And this seems really crazy to go, oh my gosh, who in the world's going to talk about metaphors and science at the same time? Well, a few people do, not many. If you kind of do a quick survey of literature about how scientists feel about metaphor, some of them like it, but there are a lot of them that don't, right? I mean, they think, oh, this is a distraction, this isn't helpful. And so, I think we oftentimes expect metaphors in poetry and things like this, but the way that we expect to encounter figurative language does not flow into our view of science. So listen to this fascinating comment by John Locke. I mean, this makes sense if you're familiar with John Locke's empiricism. Locke says, if we would speak of things as they are, we must allow that all the artificial and figurative application of words, eloquence has invented are for nothing else but to insinuate wrong ideas, move the passions, and thereby mislead the judgment. And so indeed are the perfect cheats, and therefore, however laudable or allowable oratory may render them in harangues and popular addresses, they are certainly in all discourses that pretend to inform or instruct wholly to be avoided. And where truth and knowledge are concerned, cannot be, though, a great fault either of language or the person that makes use of them. So basically, John Locke would tell us that if you are talking metaphor, you're either deceiving people, you're leading them down the wrong path, or you're involved in some immoral act of trying to persuade them against their better judgment. So if you want to be a serious thinker and a serious teacher, you should avoid them at all costs. I mean, there are so many problems, right, with that. I mean, we could spend the rest of the day just, punching Locke. But we don't want to do that. We don't need to do that. Thomas Hobbes, David Hume kind of had similar empiricist rejections of the notion of metaphors being deceptive and unhelpful and useless. And wherever you find those Hobbesian students today, you'll continue to find people who hate metaphor. They see it as inaccurate, right? However, if we just kind of take a quick survey, think about the fields of microbiology and genetics, right? DNA is referred to as the code of life. Genes are programs that drive the process. Scientists edit genetic material. Cells manufacture the building blocks of life. I mean, so much of kind of the quintessential biological phrases we talk about are in many ways metaphors that have been used by scientists to help us come to understand things about the world that we can't exactly see or flesh out in a classroom. So the potential conflict sometimes with metaphors in science is the struggle that exists with literalism, language, and truth. Okay, so I think a lot of times when people are like, well, metaphors have no place in kind of the scientific realm, there's this idea that, we want literalism, which equals truth. But let's just kind of unpack this for a second. Okay, so to say something is literal or is to be interpreted literally is not necessarily to say that it is true. We can construct all kinds of literal statements that are not factual or counterfactual. And we could say, well, it's a literal statement, it's just wrong, right? To say that something is a metaphor does not make it categorically false, only that it is not literal, right? So too often we equate the word literal with true, so therefore non-literal means false. That is a false dichotomy, and it's one that we need to recognize as doesn't hold true for the use of language. So that what we are left with then, the question we have to wrestle with is how fiction can communicate truth, something that perhaps we've long wrestled with in the realms of literature, right? I mean, we're at a classical school conference, so, every presentation must mention C.S. Lewis. And I mean, we've already done it. We've ticked that box, right? It's done. But, I mean, one of the things we see in Narnia, we love this whole epic story, and it's a story, and we would say it's fictional, right? Nobody's arguing for the empirical existence of Aslan, but there are so many true things that come through this story. So we know that truth is not tied to literalism, that figurative language can communicate truth. I love this quote by a philosopher of science named Andrew Reynolds. He writes, quote, "Science is an irreducibly human activity that requires us to create and experiment with terminology to describe phenomena and to propose explanations that make sense to us. And unless we are to create wholly new terms for every novel phenomenon, we must press existing words into new roles. That is to say, scientists must engage in metaphor." He's arguing that unless we want to, in a lab, coin a new term every time something happens, we have to begin using language in a more fluid way to try to communicate what we're seeing in the natural world. And that's exactly why, as science moves smaller into the realms of microbiology and genetics, we see metaphor rise. Why? Well, because unless we want to just fill every paper with nothing but scientific jargon that means nothing other than to the 10 people who did the research, we have to start using language in a way that means something to other people. Thus, metaphor, right? So metaphors bring disparate worlds together and become powerful vehicles for describing our experiences and perceptions of the world. And so it's through those shared understandings that scientists are able to describe a world that transcends our sense experience, whether we're talking about astrophysics at the level of the universe or atomic models at the base existence of all that we know, right? And good scientists are often creative thinkers that are able to greatly understand complex systems and mechanisms and processes, but they can effectively communicate them to others. So perhaps we think of an example would be Niels Bohr's atom as solar system model for explaining his theory of atomic realities. I mean, it is a metaphor. It is a metaphor. But it was one that was profoundly influential in shaping the way that we think about atomic realities. So when we say that we are striving to communicate our observations, maybe some of you are like, well, why can't we just use the language of the universe? Or we can describe the universe in its own terms. And if we want to shoot for the language of the universe, we'll basically have to settle for numerical explanations only. Right? All we get are numbers. But I would say that even these can also take on something of a figurative nature when we can numerically describe dimensions that are not even perceivable. Right? So the idea that numbers always directly correspond to our perceptions of the universe, even that correlation breaks down at times. Right? So we are always wrestling with how we are going to communicate what we observe. Now, what's the significance of all of this besides giving you a headache at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, right? I think the significance to think about this within the realm of science is to recognize, one, that science does not have a corner market on literalism and truth in the way that it talks about the world around us. That science has to embrace metaphor, it's embracing figurative language, and we can evaluate it as such at times. I think another significance here is that as we are doing science and we are encouraging students to think about the natural world, we ourselves should not be afraid to embrace metaphorical depictions of the universe. We should not be afraid to go out on a limb and try to make a connection between one thing and another thing in an effort to help our students understand that. Is so like, well, now we're like totally outside the realm of science. No, that's what good scientists are doing all the time. And the really good ones, the Nobel Prize winning ones, just find that metaphor that clicks for everyone. And now we'll never think about the structure of an atom differently. Right? So metaphors become very powerful in those significances. So the work that we're doing to try to understand how John Donne is employing metaphor in a poem is not that dissimilar from the creative process of trying to explain what we see in the natural world around us. We're not doing two radically different things. We're trying to build associations and help people understand how those things connect. Now, moving to the second phase then. Okay, we talked about metaphor and poetry, metaphor and science. Now let's think about metaphor and the Bible, or metaphor and theology, and how perhaps these two realms of poetry and science actually come together in the way that we think about metaphor biblically. One of the things that I have had the opportunity and privilege of thinking about for a very long time now is tree imagery in the Bible. There's some smirks in the back, and some people know I talk about trees a lot. I've written about trees a lot. And tree imagery in the Bible is one of these places where I do think that you have this robust kind of interdisciplinary thinking that goes in as we begin to analyze these metaphors. One, when we encounter tree imagery in the scriptures, it's almost entirely in poetic discourse. A lot of it is in poetry. I mean, obviously we've got the tree of life in Genesis 1, but a lot of the tree imagery we encounter is in the Psalms, it's in Jeremiah, it's in Isaiah, it's in Ezekiel, it's in Zechariah. It's coming to us in poetic explanation. So we have this kind of this imagery housed in poetry, but we also need to understand something about what is the shared reality that the biblical author is drawing on to understand this tree imagery. So for a metaphor to work, there has to be shared understanding, right? There has to be shared understanding. I gave the example in class the other day. I was like, if we were walking across campus and we saw somebody across campus and they waved, and I leaned over and I said, man, that guy is such an octopus. You'd be like, that makes me uncomfortable. What does that mean? How is that person an octopus? You'd start kind of like filing through the mental Rolodex going, what about that guy is octopus-like? I don't like that association, right? Because you would be looking for the shared understanding that's making sense of that abstract correlation. And so if we're going to rightly understand metaphor, we have to say, what is the shared understanding that's happening, and how do we get that when we're looking at a biblical metaphor, when we're looking at trees being picked up by the prophet Isaiah in the 8th century around Jerusalem? How is he talking about trees? Well, in one sense, that sends us into a historical archaeobotany, archaeological understanding of, well, what was the arboreal world of Isaiah like? And that's actually a really important question if we're going to understand how he's using this metaphor, because he expects his audience to know that. Right? He expects his audience to know that when you chop down a tree, that new growth can sprout up. He expects his audience to understand the significance of these Lebanon and anti-Lebanon regions of cedar trees that are growing north of Israel, and the symbolic nature that they begin to take for people. So he expects all of this information. Now, please don't hear me saying, you're like, oh my gosh, I thought I could read the Bible. I'm not saying that we can't read the Bible without this information. But if we really want to push in to say, what is this metaphor telling me? Like, there is an element of, we have to say, what is the shared understanding through historical and natural observation about the world that makes sense of this, right? That gives us some idea. And then we can say, okay, well, literarily then, how can we engage these metaphors in the Bible? Well, the author is communicating something. The author is doing something with these metaphors. So there's not just a historical or a natural observation element to understanding these metaphors. There then is a literary or rhetorical element. Why is the author using this metaphor in this way? Metaphors create these new associations. They can be very powerful in creating knowledge. They can be very powerful in deconstructing knowledge. Right? And so if you are Israel and you are living a life of idolatry and rebellion against the Lord, and you see yourselves as righteous and holy and good, a metaphor portraying you as an unfaithful wife can become a very deconstructive association that oftentimes the prophets would use, right? Or a metaphor of a tree that is symbolizing a kingship, right? A dynasty. This king is represented by this tree. Well, what better image to show that the dynasty has been judged other than to chop it down? And that's exactly where they go, right? That's exactly where, but nobody gives you that narrative in the Bible. Nobody gives you that narrative that says, okay, so King Josiah is a tree, but he's a bad tree, and so we're going to chop it. Now, there are a couple places. Judges 9, if you're really interested in this, there's a fascinating, Jotham has this parable about these, the trees of the people go out and ask these various trees to be king over them. So a little afternoon Bible study, read Judges 9, that's fascinating. That's one of the texts. But in the prophets, they just expect you know it. They're just like, yeah, there's these trees, and one's chopped down, and you're like, okay, what's going on? Well, the king, the dynasty, is represented by this tree, so that what would be the sustenance of this dynasty? Well, it's the water that nourishes the roots. Well, what is the expanse? How can we think about metaphorically, if a tree is a king, then how would you say that this king is exercising hegemony and power over his region? Well, his branches extend out and cast shade over all that are under him. Okay, so how would we think about his offspring? Well, he's fruitful, right? Or the roots sometimes tie into the notion of a dynasty. So all of those are these kind of metaphorical mappings placed onto this image that are just there assumed in the text, and the prophet is bringing us into this world and thinking that way. So let me just give you an example. And I spend a lot of time in Ezekiel. It has a lot of metaphors and a lot of trees. And this is just Ezekiel chapter 17 is one passage where we really see so much of this kind of constellation of metaphor brought into the biblical text. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, propound a riddle and speak a parable to the house of Israel. Say, thus says the Lord God, a great eagle with great wings and long pinions, rich in plumage of many colors, came to Lebanon and took the top of the cedar. He broke off the topmost of its young twigs and carried it to a land of trade and set it in a city of merchants. Then he took the seed of the land and planted it in fertile soil. He placed it beside abundant waters. He set it like a willow twig, and it sprouted and became a low-spreading vine. And its branches turned toward him, and its roots remained where it stood. So it became a vine and produced branches and put out boughs. And there was another great eagle with great wings and much plumage. And behold, this vine bent its roots toward him and shot forth its branches toward him from the bed where it was planted, that he might water it. It had been planted on good soil by abundant waters, that it might produce branches and bear fruit and become a noble vine. Now, I'll pause here and just kind of unpack this a little bit, right? What's going on here is that there is a king in Jerusalem during Ezekiel's day by the name of Jehoiakim, and Jehoiakim is captured and taken to exile in Babylon in 593 BC. He's the top of the tree. Right? This tree is the dynasty. This tree is kingship. Jehoiakim's this cedar top that's plucked by a great eagle, also known as Nebuchadnezzar, and taken to this market city, which is Babylon. But then this local seed is planted. And who is the local seed? It's Jehoiakim's relative, who we come to know as Zedekiah, is planted there, and God gives him everything he needs. He nourishes him, but what happens? There's another eagle that comes along, also known as Pharaoh in Egypt. And that vine, instead of staying planted there and receiving the nourishment of Yahweh, turns its roots, turns its branches toward that second eagle, that is Egypt. And then Ezekiel will go on to kind of unpack that imagery and talk about who Jehoiakim is and who Zedekiah is. But if we jump to the end of that chapter, after he kind of explains that whole like tree parable, he says, "Thus says the Lord God, I myself will take a sprig from the lofty top of the cedar and will set it out. I will break off from the topmost of its young twigs a tender one, and I myself will plant it on a high and lofty mountain. On the mountain height of Israel I will plant it, that it may bear branches and produce fruit and become a noble cedar, and under it will dwell every kind of bird in the shade of its branches. Birds of every sort will nest, and all the trees of the field shall know that I am the Lord. I bring low the high tree and make the high the low tree, dry up the green tree, and make the dry tree flourish. I am the Lord, I have spoken, and I will do it." So in this same kind of tree vine, the Lord says, you know what? The day is coming where it's not Jehoiakim that's going to get planted in Jerusalem. It's my king that's going to get planted on the high mountain of Jerusalem. And he will grow into a mighty tree that its branches will extend out so that every bird will find security and peace underneath it. And there's very much this kind of cosmic imagery of Yahweh's kingdom and Yahweh's king being planted on the mountain of Israel, all grounded in this kind of extended tree vine metaphor that is assuming we understand cedars, we understand vines, we understand a lot. I mean, this parable assumes you've got a lot of information to make any sense of it. But it's one example, and the prophets are filled. I mean, we think about Isaiah. Isaiah has lots of tree imagery as well, of ways that we see the prophets looking to the natural world to describe the things that they encounter, and for us as interpreters, to begin to ask the questions, okay, what do we know about the observed world, the natural world, that gives us a greater shared understanding, both naturally and historically, to what the biblical author was communicating, so that we can begin to perhaps push in to gain a little bit more understanding of what are these associations that are being made here, and how does that not only help us say what is the author saying, but what does this reveal about what God is doing? Right? Why is this significant to us to think about theologically? So you want to come on up?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, so we have a particular fascination with trees in our family. Oh, I don't need that. Oh, okay.
Get it.
All right. So obviously Rusty's given you a very full example here with the biblical text. If you're interested in reading and some other literature that would help you explore the metaphor that trees often help us understand. We have a couple of books here. Also, Rusty didn't say, but he's written a book called Trees and Kings, which specifically addresses the metaphor of tree imagery as it relates to kingship in the Bible. It's a bit of a heady read, but if any of you want to dive into that, you can. Also, we've both read this as a bit of a secular counterpart, I guess, to this kind of discussion. It's called The Hidden Life of Trees, written by a guy in Germany, from Germany who's a forester. Basically, he's just an amazing observer, and he just explores all the things that we could learn and apply to human community and relationships through the ways that trees exist and connect with one another. We certainly don't rubber stamp everything he says in here, but it is really interesting and fascinating. So if you love nature, you like interesting information, this is an excellent read.
I will say, like, the thing about Peter Volobin's work in The Hidden Life of Trees is it is an interesting blend of kind of poetry and science. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, it really feels kind of like a genre-breaking work. And that some people, obviously in the science world, would be like, oh, it's trash. You can't talk about that. But there are ways that it is quite interesting. And I think if you go into the book, it's like with that in mind, you're not reading an article out of Scientific American. Mm-hmm. This is kind of a naturalistic reflection that talks about nature in frequently kind of metaphorical terms, but is describing the natural world as we come to know it. It is kind of an interesting, I think, interdisciplinary example of kind of poetry and science, or how we creatively describe the world in which we see.
Or if you're like me and you're just trying to read more widely and you're not very scientifically minded, this might be a good option for you to read about trees. We also have up here Andrew Peterson's latest book, The God of the Garden, which is in and of itself kind of structured around the metaphor of the garden. There's just a lot in there about trees and garden and how his message is conveyed through using that metaphor. I just had this book up here just because it says John Dunn and it has a picture. It's actually just a biography. Unfortunately, 8th Day doesn't have any John Dunn books for you to peruse out there. But I would just mention, I did just a brief run to our library and grabbed everything I could find to see what options I had for poems to pull from. And pretty much any book that's a collection of his poetry is going to give you a lot to work with if you are interested in trying to take one of his poems and plug it into your, biology class, astronomy class, philosophy class, theology class. If you're just trying to make an effort to cross the disciplines for your students, I would highly recommend just picking up a book of his collected poetry. Any other book recommendations you have? Okay. I think we are bumping up against time. Does anyone have any questions you'd like to ask or comments? Yeah.
So,
I don't know how we do this here.
I don't know if this is a productive question, but is there a difference between figurative language and metaphor? Because metaphor acts more like a comparison. It's kind of hard to analogy for that reason.
Yeah.
Figurative language is a way of describing or interpreting some sort of
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between the two?
I would say in the realm of literature and then writing, metaphor is a subset of figurative language. But I'll let Rusty talk about conceptual metaphor maybe a little bit.
Yes.
And how that's slightly different.
Yeah, so that's a great question. When we think about metaphor as a concept, there is a way in which a simile and a metaphor are doing the same thing, right? I mean, they're pushing you in thinking about this thing as this thing. So a simile is quite, frankly, a literal statement, right? So to say, I hate.
Smile is like the sun.
Well,
The face is like the sun.
yes. So, I mean, if you say like, your smile is like the sun, I mean, you're using.
Bad simile, but it's an example.
Yeah,
Okay?
but because you're using the word like, there is an element of literalness to it. But when you say your smile is the sun, that's a truly, cannot be interpreted in any type, it is a purely figurative association. So I think both are driving the listener reader into a conceptual comparison between smile and sun. One is doing so more directly, the other is doing so in a perhaps more non-direct way. But in my study of tree imagery in the Bible, I frequently will treat similes and metaphors kind of under the same heading as figurative associations, because I do think that they're both kind of moving the reader to go, think of this thing in light of this thing, whether it's through, a simile using like or as, or whether it's a direct metaphor. And sometimes maybe the difference does reside purely in a rhetorical decision made by the author as to how punchy they want to be, right?
Just one thing that I've noticed in using metaphor or illustration of any sort is understanding the limitations that it has. Sometimes I'm communicating that with my students is that we all start off with this kind of metaphor that this is like this in a science class, and so then the student will go, well, then does it do this? Because they'll grab onto this. No, there's limits to where this goes, and it's just kind of a starter for our understanding. So.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a good point. I mean, while metaphor is helpful in interdisciplinary language, it certainly is not exhaustive, right? I mean, and I don't think we should be surprised at that. Most things in reality, the more they apply to many things, the less they become helpful specifically. And so I do think there is that give and take, right, with the nature of language. It does kind of provide these helpful organizing comparisons. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I would say in that way, it's also a little bit like visual art, which can really illuminate a concept for our students or for ourselves. I just think even of this morning, the example of the watercolor of Dante, what do we gain from that we wouldn't get just from hearing a lecture on Dante, And so even though we all acknowledge that painting, say, of biblical texts or historical events that might not be exactly accurate, how art often draws us to something and illuminates it in a new and creative way, but does have boundaries and limitations that we always have to kind of guard against the dangers of. I think of art in the church, that kind of discussion. I do think, the same can be said for metaphor, both employing it in writing and speaking, but also reading it and digesting it.
And I guess I would just add this as well, like as a communicative tool, metaphor is a big swing, right? I mean, like you either connect or you just miss. Very rarely do you hear unless it's a dead metaphor and you roll your eyes, right? I mean, but if it's a real metaphor, like you either click and you're like, yeah, that was really well said, or you're like, I have no clue what they're talking about. So there's a sense in which when you're thinking metaphorically, you are kind of making a big swing and trying to communicate something. And I guess one of the things I would want to encourage you guys as thinkers and as teachers, but also as people with students, is encourage them, take those big swings, right? Make those connections, reach across experiences into the natural world, into poetry, into theology. And as they are making those kind of big swings and big leaps, they're gonna connect sometimes. And as a teacher, you're gonna be like, that was good. And they're gonna miss sometimes. You're gonna be like, that was horrible, but a good swing. Good swing, right? I mean, it's like, Coach Miles, that was a solid swing, but you just missed. But we all know that those misses come with process. So hopefully you guys have found something that's encouraging today to take with you, to encourage you in your classroom. Thank you for your attention. I think we're out of time. So enjoy the conference.